The second half of this week's lecture is going to be on the skeletal system. And first, let's take a look at what the skeletal system does in terms of function. First of all, it's the functions it supports. It supports the head here, like the vertebral column supporting the head. The legs support the body in an upright position and allow the body to keep its shape. Secondly, it functions as protection. The rib cage protects the heart and lungs. The skull protects the head and brain. The pelvic area protects the organs in the pelvis. The third function is movement. As you can see here, the walking function requires the skeletal system to hold the legs up and support the legs so that they can transport the individual along. Fourth function is storage. There's a calcium storage, phosphate storage, and the largest repository of calcium in the body is in the skeleton. And the skeleton is what is acted upon by hormones in order to either release calcium or store calcium. And then the last function is the production of blood cells, primarily in the long bones of the leg and in the hip bones. Now there are actually 5 types or shapes of bone. These categories include long bones. This is a picture of a humerus, but another long bone would be like the femur. Another long bone would be the tibia or fibula in the leg. Flat or short bones, which are found in areas like the wrist or the ankle. Irregular bones, this is a picture of the pelvic bone. Flat bones, this is the scapula, also the skull bones. And then sesamoid bones, which are not pictured here. Sesamoid bones are bones that form inside tendons. For example, in the patellar tendon, which attaches the leg muscles to the tibia, there's the kneecap, and that is a sesamoid bone. Now I'm going to use this picture just to go over some bones, and we'll go over these again in more detail. But if you start from the bottom, the toes and the fingers are called phalanges. The bones in the foot are called metatarsals. The bones in the hand are called metacarpals. The wrist is called the carpals. The ankle is called the tarsals. The 2 bones in the lower extremity are the fibula, which is non-weight bearing, and the tibia, which is weight bearing. Here's the patella, which is the kneecap, the femur, and then the pelvic. The tailbone is called the coccyx. The sacrum is this part of the pelvis here, which is part of the spinal column. The iliac wings are also sometimes called coxa. The vertebral column here. Then in the arms, if you look at the legs, the arms are the radius and the ulna. The femur is the upper arm. It's attached to the collarbone, which is the clavicle, and the shoulder blade, which is the scapula. The chest bone or breastbone is called the sternum. And then you have your ribs. This is again part of the vertebral column, and then the skull up here with various bones in the skull. In the jaw is the mandible. The upper part where the upper teeth are is the maxilla. And then you have the frontal maxilla bone, the temporal bones on the sides. In the back, we have the occipital bone and the parietal bone in the skull. Again, the vertebral column. Here are the scapular wings again, here and here. This is the back side of the sacrum. And these are the general bones that we will be talking about later on as we move through the system. Now there are 2 types of bone. There's the compact, which is shown here, and spongy bone here. The compact bone or spongy bone is where we find the process of hematopoiesis, at least in the femur and in the pelvis. And hematopoiesis is the function of producing blood cells. The compact bone is the dense bone, where the matrix is organized in tubes of bone called osteons. And I don't have a picture here to show that, but this hard, dense bone right along here is compact bone. Then the cancellous or spongy bone is up here. And this is much looser networks of bony tissue. Now, the bone is also divided into parts. The long shaft of the bone is called the diaphysis, and the short ends of both ends of the bone are called the epiphysis. Between the two is called the epiphyseal plate, and the epiphyseal plate is the site of bone growth. And so in children, this is open and growth continues. And once this plate closes, then the person no longer grows in height and their arms no longer get any longer. Now, the process that occurs here is called ossification during bone growth, and this is the formation of new bone. On the ends where the bone enters the joint is called the articular cartilage, and this is the articular cartilage. This is a femur, by the way, and this is the part that goes in the hip right here, and this is the articular cartilage of the hip, and then this is the lower end of the femur, which is where the knee is. And then around the outside of the bone is a membrane that goes around all around the outside except for the area of articular cartilage. And this membrane or sheath of tissue contains the blood vessels and nerves, and it's called the periosteum. Now, this periosteum is the only part of the bone that feels pain. So when you want to do something to the bone, if you want to numb it up, all you have to do is make sure you spray the periosteum with your numbing agent, and once you enter the bone, there's no pain felt. Now, the skeleton is divided into two parts. The first part, shown on the left here, is the axial skeleton. The dark here is the axial skeleton. The axial skeleton is the central aspect of the skeleton, and it supports the head, neck, and trunk. And this is the axial part. And the other part is over on this side is the limbs, and this is called the appendicular skeleton. It's attached to the axial skeleton and makes up the limbs, the upper arm and the lower leg. Now, looking at more detail, we're going to go over this again to help you remember it. On the left here is the pectoral girdle, which means the part that's attached to the chest. The collarbone is also called the clavicle. Use the word clavicle on a quiz or test. The shoulder blade in the back is called the scapula. And these two come together along with the humerus to form the shoulder joint, which is very mobile. It's not very strong, but it's very mobile. If you go down the humerus, you reach the elbow, and then you have the radius, and the radius is on the thumb side. Think that your thumb radiates, and that'll help you remember that the radius is on the thumb side. And the ulna is on the pinky finger side, and the ulna is what forms the elbow. Then you have the 8 bones in the wrist called carpals, the hand, which are called metacarpals, and then the fingers or digits are called the phalanges. Moving over to the pelvis, you have the ilial wings here and here, also called coxal bones, and on a quiz or test you can call these coxal bones or ilial wings. This is the sacrum, which is the lower part of the spinal column, or the vertebral column, excuse me. The connection of the two halves of the pelvis is called the symphysis pubis, and this is a joint area right here. Then you have the femur, which is a ball joint into the socket in the hip area. The patella or kneecap. The tibia, which is the weight-bearing aspect of the lower leg, and then the fibula, which is this back part here. Tarsals or ankle, metatarsals of the foot, and phalanges are the toes. Moving on to the skull, you have a lateral view of the skull here and a frontal view of the skull here. This is the frontal bone of the skull. Underneath, this is actually pointing back here, is where the sphenoid bone is. It's also a little bit of it is, you can see it from the outside here. This is the maxilla on both sides, and here is the mandible. And the mandible is the only movable part of the skull. It's the only bone that moves on the skull. Now from the side, on front, you can't see the parietal bone, but on the side you can. So here's the frontal bone here, the parietal bone here, and the temporal bone over on the side here. Frontal, parietal, temporal bone, and in the back is the occipital bone. The mandible and the maxilla. Now, these lines that attach these bones to each other are called sutures. And these are joints because they're connections between two bones, and in this case they're immovable. Any projection is called a process. So here we have a mandibular process, we have a temporal bone process, etc. A meatus is a hole, and here's the external auditory meatus, which is where the ear sound enters into the skull through this hole, and this is called the external auditory meatus. A foramen is another hole, and the only foramen that we can see on this picture is back here, and it's the optic foramen where the optic nerve comes through. And then lastly, we have areas of hollowed out areas. The maxillary area is hollowed out, that's called the maxillary sinus. There's frontal areas hollowed out, that's called the frontal sinus, and there are various sinuses throughout the head. Now this is the spinal column, or vertebral column. Vertebral column is made up of 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, 5 lumbar vertebrae, 5 sacral vertebrae, and the coccyx. You notice that it's an S shape. It's an S shape in order to be a shock absorber and absorb shock, so that if you sit down hard, it absorbs that shock rather than transmitting it directly to the bottom of your skull. This is one vertebral bone. It's made up of a body, vertebral body. The transverse processes are here. The pedicle is here. This is called the lamina, and the spinous process here. One joint occurs here and the other is here. The disc, intravertebral disc, is here, and it's between each of these bones. It's tough cartilage, and it supports and absorbs shock as well. The foramen here, the vertebral foramen, also called the spinal canal, is where the spinal cord moves or comes through. And there's also something called the spinal foramen here and here, where the spinal nerves come out from the spinal cord out into the body. This is the thoracic cage. The thoracic cage is made up of the various ribs, the sternum, and the thoracic vertebrae in the back. We also show in this picture the clavicles. The sternum is made up of 3 bones: the manubrium, which is this top part, the body of the sternum here, and the xiphoid process here. And this junction here is called the sternal angle. You have 7 true ribs, which means they are connected directly to the sternum with costal chondrus. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sternal ribs, or true ribs. And then you have false ribs, which are not connected directly to the sternum, but they are connected to this one cartilage which is connected to here. And then in the back you have two floating ribs which are not connected to the sternum by any means.